In the year 913, near Gorgan, on the southeastern coast of the Caspian Sea, in modern-day Iran, a vast fleet of 500 warships came into view of the shocked and terrified traders and townspeople arrayed by the shore. They'd had their fair share of raiders over the years, riding down from the Caucasus from the steppe lands to the north, and across the Persian plains from the east. But it immediately became apparent that this was different. They were ships unlike any the locals had seen before. Small, exceptionally mobile, masted war galleys fronted by snarling dragon heads, manned by strong northern oarsmen and filled with axe-wielding raiders. Their leaders were Scandinavians, the rest an amalgamation of Scandinavian and Slav, and they had travelled for hundreds of miles along the vast networks of rivers in Eastern Europe to raid the shores of the Caspian Sea. Their overlord Igor had recently, in 912, been crowned as the king of the Kiev and Rus, a huge area encompassing parts of modern-day Russia and much of the Ukraine and the surrounding countries. At the time of his death, he ruled over the largest state in Europe. Ever since the 8th century, Scandinavians had not only looked to the west for expansion, but to the east as well. Whereas opportunistic young Danes and Norsemen tended to look westward to Great Britain, France and the North Sea, to at first trade and later raid and settle in order to make a better life for themselves outside of their barren, overpopulated homelands. The people of modern-day Sweden had long looked eastward across the Baltic Sea to Finland, the Baltic states and Russia for opportunities of their own. And as the years went by, they gradually began to look further and further afield. In the west, when Scandinavians went raiding, they were known as Vikings, which derives from the Old Norse term for sea raider or pirate. In the east, however, they were known as Varangians, which likely derives from the Old Norse word var, meaning pledge, and gengi, meaning sword companion. The large majority population of Slavic peoples who lived in these lands seem to have merged somewhat with the Varangians, who generally seem to have formed a ruling elite, and together they began to forge a new, distinct culture, different from the Slavic tribes which bordered their lands, and different from the Scandinavians to the north. Large cities were founded in places such as Novgorod and Kiev, where Scandinavian customs gradually, over the generations, began to give way to a new amalgamation of Slav and Scandinavian. The Rorikid dynasty, allegedly founded by the semi-legendary heroic prince Rorik in the second half of the 9th century, and solidified by his successor Oleg, established themselves firmly as the masters of the Rus people and began to rule a roughly centralised state, ruled by local strongmen and based on tribute. When the next ruler, Igor, came to the throne in 913, he inherited a huge landmass of wild river systems and towns, still largely chaotic, but all pledging allegiance to the overall ruler at Kiev. The society of the Rus was undoubtedly martial in nature, still awash in the Scandinavian culture of their forefathers. They worshipped the Norse gods and undertook the ancient Scandinavian funerary practice of ship burial, as evidenced by first-hand accounts written by Muslim travellers such as Ibn Fadlan during the 10th century, and also by substantial hard archaeological evidence. The 913 expedition into the Caspian Sea was probably the furthest and most ambitious voyage that Scandinavians had ever undertaken. It's unclear whether Igor was personally involved, although as ruler he would likely have given consent and patronised the expedition. The raiders loaded up on huge amounts of loot at Baku in modern-day Azerbaijan and harried the Iranian coastline for weeks, until finally, on their way home, they were defeated by the Khazars, themselves a strong tribal confederation of Asiatic steppe nomads, who ruled over a substantial empire to the east of the Rus, and held a monopoly over the lucrative trade routes of the region. The Rus continued to raid all over their world, but the biggest prize of all lay directly to the south of them, over the Black Sea, at Constantinople, known to them as Miklagard. Long the centre of world civilization, Constantinople, now modern-day Istanbul, was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the unbroken continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire. It was a vast city surrounded by the incredibly strong Theodosian walls, which had never been breached. In 941, Igor, at the head of a large fleet, arrived seemingly out of nowhere along with a huge army. Greater armies than them had tried, however, and despite a valiant first attempt, the Byzantines held them off. They attacked again in 944, and their small, highly manoeuvrable longships proved difficult to deal with. Ultimately, however, the fleet was destroyed by Greek fire, an ancient and highly effective technique long held secret by the Byzantines. In the aftermath, Igor's position was still so strong that the Byzantines made a truce with him on favourable terms. Meanwhile, in 943, another, more successful raid on the Caspian took place. This time, the Rus captured the city of Barka in modern-day Azerbaijan, where they stayed for several months, massacring the local population and amassing a substantial plunder, before dysentery forced them to head back north, ships laden with massive amounts of loot and slaves. This time, however, they made it back without Khazar involvement, who themselves would be next on the agenda. The 943 raid was likely just one of many at the time, and simply represented the largest and most worthy of chronicling. Eventually, under Igor's successor, Svatoslav, large Khazar cities such as Sarkal and Kerch began to be plundered and destroyed, which had the long-term effect of destabilising the Khazar Khaganate, until it was eventually defeated entirely by the Rus over the coming decades. In 945, in a manner perhaps befitting the harsh and brutal nature of his rule, Igor was captured and gruesomely killed by the Drevlians, a subject Slavic tribe. According to the primary chronicle of the Rus, after attempting to tax the Drevlians in too harsh a manner, they captured Igor and tied him down to 2 bent-over birch trees, which were then released and allowed to straighten, thus tearing his body apart and killing him instantly. His wife Olga, upon hearing the news, wiped out the Drevlians entirely in retribution, burning many alive in buildings and enslaving the rest, before consolidating her power by ruling as regent for her young son Svatoslav. Olga was a recent convert to Christianity, and while the young heir to the throne continued to worship the Norse gods of his father, more and more Rus became interested in the Eastern Orthodox faith of Byzantium. Just like the Vikings in the West, who had settled in Great Britain and France, eventually became Catholic, the Varangians of the East soon became influenced by the Byzantine culture that they at first attacked, but later learned from and eventually, in part, adopted. Svatoslav continued the Rus policy of persistently raiding and attacking pretty much all of the peoples around them, later earning the title the Brave, and being remembered as one of the greatest kings of European history. He allied with the Byzantines at times and fought against them at others, as well as waging successful campaigns against the Bulgar Empire and the Khazar Khaganate. By his death, Svatoslav ruled over one of the most powerful states in Europe, and arguably the largest. Under his descendant, Vladimir the Great, in the late 10th century, the Rus gradually became Eastern Orthodox Christians, and long-time allies of Byzantium, before eventually, over the centuries, they gradually evolved into the modern-day nation-states of Russia and Ukraine. Unlike practically any other dynasty from the early Middle Ages, the Rurikids allegedly survived as rulers in Russia in an unbroken line of succession from Prince Rurik all those centuries ago, until finally they were replaced by the Romanovs in the 17th century. Cadet branches of the family also ruled all over Eastern Europe during the Middle Ages, thus contributing to the formation of many of the modern-day nation-states in the area.